see the world that needs a second look. And that is what I mean by this fact that it behoves us to question our questions. Now, why is the question, what is reality, a question that needs to be questioned, that needs to be interrogated? Simply put, the reason for it is because the moment we ask the question of what is reality, we, meaning whoever is asking that question, I, let's say I, and by I don't mean me, I don't mean Aziz Ismail, I mean the I which is representative of any questioner at all. The moment we ask the question, the moment I ask the question, I have separated or distanced myself from that question. I am standing aside from reality and wanting to understand it. And that is self defeating. It is somehow self sabotaging because if I stand outside or pretend to stand outside reality, but on the other hand, I'm part of it. And therefore, I cannot raise the question of that of which I am myself, an inseparable and inextricable part. You know, Hegel uh, has a little discussion in one of his books, very hard to read because Hegel is almost impossible to read, but um, very stimulating. Uh, when he talks about the infinite, he says that the infinite must exist. Because why must we think that the infinite must exist? It's for these reasons, and I'm trying to summarize Hegel's argument now in a very few sentences. Suppose nothing infinite exists. If nothing infinite exists, then there are two possibilities. Either nothing exists, or some things exist which are finite. Now, if we consider these two possibilities in turn, the first, that nothing exists, is obviously not acceptable because the very fact that we are raising the question shows that something exists, at least I exist in raising that question. So, the second option is that some finite things exist, but there can not be something finite without the infinite because being finite is a part, it's a negation of the infinite. Therefore, the infinite, he says, must exist. But if then we say that the infinite must exist, and if we then go on to say that the infinite is by definition the non-finite, because it is infinite, non-finite, then it is no longer infinite. Because what being infinite means is that it has no boundaries, it has no borders, it has no um, limits. But if we say that there are finite things, then there is a boundary to the infinite. The infinite stops at the boundary beyond which there are the limited things. the finite things. And therefore, there is a kind of a paradox about talking about the infinite. Now, I've gone very fast over this, and obviously it requires time to unpack it, but I will leave it at that. Um, and I'll come back to this issue shortly, but I won't talk about Hegel, but I'll talk about it in the context of the Ginans. Now, the first thing I would like to say about the Ginans, when I talk about reality, and I related reality, the notion of reality, to the infinite, the first thing I would like to say is that there is no word in the Ginans for reality. Um, there is no single word for it. The nearest one might think of is the word hakikat, which is it is a Persian, originally Arabic hakika, but that word is not central to the Ginans, although it occurs in, and I can only recall one particular Ginan which talks about the Shariat and Tariqat and Hakikat and Marifat. It's not central to the Ginans. Much more central to the Ginans is another word, which is simply truth. Sat. Sat is a uh, variation of the Sanskrit satya, which means truth. And that word is pervasive in the Ginans. It occurs again and again. So there is the Ginan, for instance, which says Sate Bolo, Sate Chalo, speak the truth and walk in truth. Even the Pir himself, who is called the Satguru, which is the one who teaches the truth or speaks the truth, or I would put it slightly differently now. I would say one who speaks from the truth. Now, truth here is not what philosophers, or what logicians rather, call propositional truth. Propositional truth is the truth of a statement. And let's find an example. So, supposing we say, because last night I was watching the news on the television, so this example is fresh in my mind. Is it true that the nuclear arsenals in Iran were obliterated? Now, that they were obliterated is a proposition. And you might say, yes, it is true that they were obliterated, or that it is not true that they were obliterated. If they were not, it is not true that they were obliterated, then what President Trump said is not true. But what might be true is that he obliterated the truth. But this is propositional truth, is the truth of a statement. What is meant by truth in the Ginans is not propositional truth, it is the truth which is the reality, which is the ground of things. It's about that by reference to which everything else gets its meaning and its existence. Or you might say that it is the ground through which we can conceive, we can think of everything else that exists, because we cannot think about anything unless we think of it in terms of truth or untruth. And this is not enough as yet philosophically to capture that word. It is not enough because that ground, the truth, reality, matters to us. And so I come to a very important issue about the Ginans. It is not a study of reality. It is not a theory of reality. It is a way of thinking which is the foundation of a practical life. It is in its own way an answer to the question which Socrates raised long time ago, which was the question of how are we to live? And to be in touch with reality is to have an answer, to not to what is there, but to have an answer to what is there as part ultimately of the answer to how are we to live. Now, this is a common theme in classical philosophy. You see, all religions and all ancient philosophers believed that there is a reality which encompasses everything else. So, for example, Aristotle begins his very famous book, the Nicomachean Ethics. It's a great work of ethics. And he begins by saying, and I'm simply summarizing, I'm paraphrasing, that every kind of knowledge and every activity which human beings undertake is for the sake of some good. Some good is its aim. It's the end for which people are striving. So, for example, uh, people trade in order to get wealthy. And wealth is a kind of a good. People look after their bodies, they go on a diet. This is not Aristotle. I'm talking from a modern point of view because going on a diet seems more and more necessary nowadays. People go on a diet in order to lose weight, but they lose weight in order to be healthy because health is a form of a good. But Aristotle says wealth and health are intermediate goods. They are subordinate goods. They are goods in the service of some other final good. Now, many philosophers have pointed out that Aristotle has made a logical mistake here. And I think he has. It's quite correct that he has. The logic is mistaken. Why is it mistaken? It's mistaken in the way it goes from the fact that everyone searches for some good. Therefore, there is a good that everyone searches. Now that argument is doesn't quite work because it's like arguing um, that let's see, it's like saying because everyone has a mother, therefore it follows that there is somebody who is everyone's mother. You see, that conclusion doesn't follow from the fact that everyone has a mother. It does not follow that there is a mother who is everyone's, there is a person who is everyone's mother. But this logical mistake is not actually a mistake because Aristotle did believe that there is a final good which to which all other good things like health, wealth, material well-being, fame, honor, reputation, etc., which are all good things, are subordinate. And the Ginans are aligned with this in their belief that there is one overall reality. There is a all encompassing reality which forms the ultimate grounds of everything that we encounter in life. Now, I've been talking about reality, which is an abstract concept. I said that there is no equivalent word in the Ginans for reality, and the reason is because the Ginans are a form of religious poetry. They are not written as philosophy. And the equivalent in religion to ultimate reality is God. When we think of God, we immediately fall into Well, there is a pitfall in front of us. The pitfall is that we begin to think of God as a being, as a supreme being, as a creator. And there we get into that same position that I mentioned earlier of thinking about reality by extricating yourself from it and standing apart from it. In other words, looking at it, thinking of it theoretically, or thinking of it in the light or in the mode or in the way of an observer. Now, here I always think of something that a modern philosopher, modern in the sense, having lived the last century, Heidegger. Heidegger had one great thesis in all his work, which is that Western philosophy uh, has forgotten the notion of being. What he meant by that is that, well, let me just explain in a few sentences what he meant by it. Heidegger pointed out that ordinarily we do not encounter things theoretically. We only encounter them in our uses of things. We use things. For instance, a carpenter does not think of a hammer as a hammer. The carpenter in his workshop reaches out to a hammer. Maybe he looks at it from the corner of his eye, but he simply picks it up spontaneously, almost unconsciously, as though the hammer was part of his arm. He doesn't even think of his arm or his hands as a physiologist might or as a doctor might. It is simply something that we exercise, that we use. The hammer just becomes an instrument which unconsciously is used in the act of creating a table, putting together, let's say, a chair or a piece of furniture. Why does the carpenter make a table or a piece of furniture? Well, in order to sell it. But the carpenter, in the carpenter's mind, the economy, the selling of the furniture, where it will go, the money it will bring, are all unconsciously, I shouldn't say unconsciously, a better word is unreflectively. They are unreflectively in the background. He simply acts with these things, this intelligibility, which is at the back of his mind. But let us say one day the hammer breaks. When the hammer breaks, let's say it comes apart, the head and the body of it breaks. Then then the carpenter looks at it. He says, "What's gone wrong here?" Now the hammer has become an object of observation. It is something that he looks at, that he stares at. Now Heidegger's, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible because the Heidegger's text is very difficult to read. But ultimately, these texts are valuable only if you can distill them into terms that everyone can understand. And I would try to understand it this way, which is actually what Heidegger does say, is that we have become accustomed to looking at beings, things, in a scientific way. So, for instance, when a botanist looks at a plant or as a tree, he looks at it in terms of its composition, the chlorophyll, photosynthesis, etc., etc. But when you sit in a garden, you are not being a botanist. You are enjoying the garden. When you look at, when you are walking, you walk past a tree, or you might sit under a tree on a hot day for the shade that it gives. And this everyday connection with things is a connection in which things are not things. Things are not observed as things. And religion goes wrong when it becomes theology, in the sense that God, instead of being the basis of one's existence, becomes a concept to be considered, the concept of a creator, the concept of somebody other than me. I'm using this idea in order to get back to a problem we always have when we think about religion, in the sense that we tend to externalize. Now, think of, for example, people who ask questions, as young people are said to ask questions nowadays about the meanings of rituals. What does this or that ritual in the Jamaat Khana mean? And I've always wondered about this question itself, the question of what does it mean? When does anybody ask the question? In my parents' generation, this question was never asked. What do these rituals mean? Or in my grandparents' generation, we go further back and it becomes even clearer that this was not a question that would have arisen in their minds. Now we have a common way of explaining this, which is to say that we are somehow more intelligent or educated than our parents or grandparents were. And therefore, our young people who are more intelligent and better educated will not settle for an unself conscious practice. Now, this is not true. It is not true because no one generation is more intelligent than another. There were highly intelligent people in the past, as there were also stupid people in the past. And there are many stupid people today, as there are also intelligent people. If intelligence was something that became better and better and better, like technology, because the intelligence does not work in the same way that technology does. Technology improves, although it also has a dark side. Every time it improves, it also presents new problems, as you know, with AI, artificial intelligence today, which incidentally is a misnomer, because artificial intelligence is not intelligence. It's a big subject, but I don't want uh, to expand on it. Maybe at some other time in the future, this would be a topic to discuss. The point is that it is not because the younger generation is more educated or more intelligent. It's because the rituals have become alien to them. When rituals become alien, one asks the meaning of things. Because when the rituals were part and parcel of one's life, one just did them spontaneously. They were they were uh, meaningful, and there is a difference between something being meaningful and having a theoretical meaning applied to something. So I will leave this again as a thought with you. So, in word, in a word, the problem that we are dealing with is our habit of applying a theoretical model. Now, when I say theoretical model, it's worth thinking about the word theory. The word theory comes from Greek, and it actually means to look at something, to behold, to contemplate. And that sums up the criticism that Heidegger is making. Namely, that when we think of things theoretically, as a scientist does, and mind you, there's nothing wrong about science. I mean, this is not a criticism of science because it is quite appropriate to science that it must think theoretically. It has to. All that one is saying, which is a lot that one is saying, so yeah, is that the problem lies in applying the scientific model, of importing the scientific model into thinking about ethics or thinking about religion, where it is a as a person in whose existence is in question that one seeks these meanings. It is, in other words, an existential issue. It is not a theoretical issue. So I am related to this reality, which in religion we call God, which in philosophy we would call reality. I am related to it in a special way. That is the way of a fish in the water. And when we talk about a fish in the water, we think of two things. We are thinking about fish and we are thinking about the water. But that is because it is we and not the fish which is thinking. In our eyes, the fish is one thing and the water is another. But let's say if we were able to enter into the mind of a fish, if there was such a thing, at least there is some kind of a brain there, then it doesn't think of itself as itself in something else which is called water. And this is the sort of thing that only poetry captures, not prose. And that is the reason why religious language, in its pure form, is always poetic language. Now, I want to go on I'll talk for another 10 or 15 minutes at the most, and then I will open up for questions. The Ginans, of course, are talking as in the mode of, as I said, religious poetry. So they talk about God in various guises or various aspects of divinity. So they speak, for instance, of Vishnu, of Brahma, of Shiva or Maheshwar. They speak of Hari. They speak of avatars, the incarnations of the divine. And as you might be familiar, if you're familiar with the Ginans, you will know that it talks about 10 avatars, the Das avatar, of which the last avatar we tend to associate with. Now, I want to come to a problem about this association with Ali or Hazrat Ali, which is not actually how the Ginans present it. The Ginans are talking about the 10 incarnations. Now, let us just ask this question. What kind of beings are these avatars? What are they? Where do they exist? Do they exist? Now, in one sense, of course, they exist because we are talking about it right now. So they exist as ideas. You might say, if they exist as ideas, are they figments of the imagination? They do exist in our imagination. But we tend to think that what exists in our imagination is imaginary. And when we use the word imaginary, we mean something fictitious, something that doesn't really exist. Now, that doesn't fit what uh, the way in which these beings are spoken of in the Ginans, because, first of all, it's not one person's imagination, it's the imagination of a whole community. And it's the imagination not just of a whole community, but a community in its time, meaning in the past, present, in a chain of ensuing, ongoing generations that cannot be simply a figment of one's imagination. So they are obviously something that we tend to say they are mythological concepts. And I have over many, many years now wondered about this word mythology or mythic. I've asked myself whether there might not be a better word for mythology or mythic, because this word mythic is not actually used by those who create and think in mythological terms themselves. It is a word used by those who are out of that language and think of that language in contrast to modern scientific language. Let us, because I don't have time to go deeper into this, let's just say they are representations of the divine. They are forms not to be taken literally, in which the divine is presented in the Ginans. That is why I say, let us think of them as representations. Now, I have used the word literally. What does that mean? There are two ways in which we can go wrong in taking ancient Islamic and Ismaili and Ginanic ideas literally. One example is of the kind of Neoplatonic cosmology that you find in ancient Ismaili writers like Nasir Khosrow. Now, those who are familiar with those texts of Nasir Khosrow, of Sijistani, of Hamidul bin Kirmani, of Nasafi, and so on, will remember that they talk about there being something like the one reality, who issues an order, al-amra, out of which comes what is called the universal intellect, the akal al-kul, out of which emanates or originates nafs al-kul, the universal soul. My very simple basic question is this: what are these things? Where do they exist? And this is where, if you think of them literally as descriptive, if they are describing the constitution of the universe, if, in other words, you read this text as telling you that the universe consists of the universal intellect, the akal al-kul, and the nafs al-kul, the universal soul, and so on, then you have alternative conceptions of the universe, which is the conception you have in modern physics, in quantum mechanics, for instance. And there is no way in which you can say that the ancient cosmology can survive in the face of modern physics. because modern physics is far more accurate and and fertile characterization or description of the universe than the old cosmology. And therefore, there has to be, if you want to preserve the old, and you see what I'm trying to say, and I'll say this very quickly, I can't elaborate on it, is that you do a disservice to the value, to the meaning of these authors, Sijistani, Nasir Khusro, etc., if you take them literally today. That is one way to go wrong in taking the ancient texts literally. The other way, and this is more relevant to the Ginans, is if you take the avatars, for instance, literally. And here there arises a problem if you think of Ali as the 10th avatar. Why? Because Ali is a person, is a historical person who lived at a certain time, lived a certain kind of life, did certain kinds of actions. A person whom you can study historically. And if you conflate the historical person with the conception of the divine, the representation of the divine, then you lose the whole spiritual world altogether. And it becomes particularly problematic then if from Ali you then come to the contemporary Imam at whatever time. Because you have to remember that when the Ginans were being composed, the people who composed them, people who lived in India, were not thinking of the Imam in the very personal terms that we think today. Because for them he was a remote figure whom they had never seen, and having never seen him or having had no access to him, not being able even to imagine him in any concrete way, made it in a way pure representation rather than the person that we think about. Now, this change occurred, and it's not. I mean, it's a change which is like they say Sirat al-Mustaqim is. You see, it's a road with mountains on one side, rocks on one side, and valleys, depths on the other. And you have to walk on a very finely tuned balance. You see, in the time of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, in this also the late 19th century and then the early decades of the 20th century, the Imam who was present among the Indian Jamaats became a figure with whom the Ginans were brought into a union, into a kind of a harmony. So when, for instance, the Ginans, if you think of the Ginan called Anand Anand Karyori Kisar, incidentally, that was a Ginan which even as a child I remember always being spoken on Kushiali Day, what we now call Imamat Day. It was also the Ginan which was um, apparently, evidently, spoken every time the Imam visited the Jamaats. I'm talking about Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah now. The third verse of that Ginan talks about Jampudip, and people then identified Jampudip with India, meaning the Indian subcontinent, not India as differentiated from Pakistan. I mean the subcontinent. But the Jampudip is not a geographical term; it's a mythological term. It's a mythological region, just like Central Deep, which is not actually Iran. It is a mythological rather than a geographical conception. So here you have two things merging. One, representations of the divine, and the other, a person in an actual region, geographical place, who is also seen as a representation of the divine. And the temptation arises. And when I say temptation, this is the temptation of our thoughts. It's the way our intellect travels, which is to conflate the two. And we take it literally. And once you take it literally, you lose the whole issue, the whole uh, wealth of the symbolic meanings of reality that I have been talking about. And this is incidentally not an issue about uh, Hindu versus Islamic, because the Islamic God, the God of the Quran, is also mythological. It's also a representation. The God who creates, the God who punishes, the God who gets angry, the God who, there are lots and descriptions of God just like a person. That is as much of a representation as the avatars in the Ginans. It is wrong to think that somehow the Islamic concept is purer than the Ginanic concept, because all of them are representations of God. And if all of them are representations of God, it is because it is only as representations that we can think of God. We cannot think of God as He is in Himself. And I would go into further abstraction to connect with what I said earlier. We cannot think of reality uh, in itself. Fine. Now I'm moving towards a close. Before closing, I want to take up this question which I left pending, which was of contemporary relevance. Can the Ginans continue to speak to us today? Now I want to raise this question. This is very important now. I want to raise it, excuse me, I want to raise it in two steps. The first step, we live in a world in which the prospects for self improvement, self amelioration, of the betterment of the human condition are infinitely greater than they were in the time of the Ginans. In the villages, you see, in medieval Indian villages, as in Europe, elsewhere, everywhere, people led a life. There was no such thing as creating new things in your life. You see, for example, the economy. People made money just in order to live. The idea that money could be invested, the idea that money can generate money was alien to earlier ages. Money was simply a form of currency for satisfying your hunger and your shelter, your daily needs. Some were, of course, wealthy, others were poor. But the idea that money could be invested and money could produce more money comes with a capitalist economy. And a capitalist economy is a product of modern times. So it comes into being after the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Therefore, in the Ginans, the world is a sad, sorrowful thing, you see. It is not a world in which you better yourself, partly because of this economic issue, but also because you have science, you have new knowledge, you have the sciences of nature, including the science of medicine. Now, in that kind of a world where you can better and improve in a continuing progression your condition on earth is the idea of salvation, is the idea that the human condition is in need of redemption. Is that idea redundant? Is it superfluous? Now, I would say no, because the two ideas are not incompatible. And the fact that they are not incompatible, I think, was brought out very well in a letter that the 40th Imam, Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, wrote, and I will quote this. He said, Ismailis, now I'm taking a middle part of the one paragraph out of it, which is relevant to what I'm saying. Ismailis in prayers go to a higher and higher stage till the supreme spiritual stage reached immediately after death, when the real calls the apparent to itself. You see, this notion of the real calling the apparent to itself. I hope you can see the connection of it to the notion of reality that I was talking earlier. But then uh, he goes on to say, but Islam and Ismailism much more so insists on action. Without action, faith is useless. Without action, prayer becomes pride. With total absorption in your occupation during the day and higher prayers at night, a new life may come, provided the two occupations are total. Now, here we have something new, but it is something new which does not displace the old. It reconciles two different things. On the one hand, there is world involvement, which you don't see in the Ginans, because we live in a time, as I said, as I just described it, where there is a positive aspect to the world. But then there is also a distinction made in this same passage between this everyday world and what is ultimately real, the real as opposed to the apparent. But this, you see, all this does is to say that the two things, living in the world and also finding the world to be a problem, to be deficient, are compatible. I want to go beyond this idea of compatibility now. And so I want to raise another question. And that other question is this: in the race that we now have in the world at large, the mad race as it happens, for ever new frontiers of exploration, and not only exploration, but also exploitation of not just the earth, but as will happen in the not too distant a future, perhaps, exploration, but also exploitation of the moon, of Mars, and beyond that, elsewhere in the universe, in this relentless, unyielding, hectic search and achievement of new methods of self satisfaction and self gratification, of mastery over the universe, genetic rewiring, undoing, if not reversing, the natural effects of aging, in this limitless drive and hunger for prosperity, there still lurks a question, I think, in the depths and perhaps the hidden depths of the modern human being. And that question is, What is it for? What is the point of it all? What does it mean? What does life mean? Now, I would like to put it to you that this question, what is the point of it? What do we live for? This hunger, this lack somewhere in one's being, in one's essence, from which this question arises, is part of human nature. You cannot do away with it. Animals are happily here, happily exempt from it, because animals live and die. We also live and die. But unlike animals, living and dying matters to us. We ask why. What is the point of it all? And this is what distinguishes us from human beings. And if the modern West, and I don't mean the West because I don't like these antithesis between Islam and the West or the East and the West. But if, as it is very true, that the modern West, the modern secular West, has lost this or become oblivious to this question, then it signifies a certain amputation in our being, in human nature. And this is where I think it is sobering and it is relevant to remember the cautionary words of our late great Imam when he referred to Occidentalization. Occidentalization simply means westernization in English. I mean, Occidentalization is a more of a Latinate word and it is more at home in French. But basically, it means westernization, by which I mean what the West has become today. Um, there is an issue there. There is a problem. And I think that if we are not aware of this, if we lose touch with that question of what is the point of one's existence, which is part of the question of what is reality, not as a theoretical question, but a question of how we are to live and what we mean to ourselves, then we will have lost something very precious. And we will have lost, and Islam also will have lost something precious in its entire history. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Ismail. What a treat, what a journey. Uh, thanks for raising some of these challenges. We have some questions that we have received from the audience, and I'll be posing some of that. But while I was listening to you, and when you were talking about Heidegger, um, and you use this example of hammer, carpenter almost kind of looking at the hammer as an extension of his limb, uh, and only when the hammer breaks down that the hammer is observed. So there is an observer and an object of that observation. Now, suddenly I feel that Ginans, while you were applying it to other aspects of your talk, I was also thinking of Ginans, like the way we are kind of looking at Ginans in a very technical, scientific way, as if an object of study. It seems, I mean, I remember my childhood when Ginans were part of everything. While making me sleep, my mother used to sing Ginans. I remember my wife singing Ginans to my child. Um, Ginans were sung while women were kind of sitting and chatting, and suddenly somebody would start singing Ginan. Ginans were everywhere. Ginans were part of the life. I mean, we didn't need an occasion to start singing Ginans, and there were hardly any talks on Ginans. I mean, alwaises, as they were called missionaries in those days. Missionaries would come to Jamaat Khana and they would use Ginans. They would start, and even in the wars, they would start singing, and Jamaat would participate. And suddenly, it has become a very kind of educational, scientific, technical exercise of studying Ginans. Do you think that Ginans, we have lost that touch with Ginans, and it has become, there's something damaged there?
Yeah, there is certainly a loss, but I would not see it as a final loss. I would not see it as a, in one way, I would see it as inevitable,
Okay.
partly because either we have lost the language itself
Mm,
for people who are brought up entirely in the West now, or a connection with the old language, which would apply even to people who do know Gujarati and other languages in India, for instance. I mean, they are not more in touch with it simply because they know the languages, because that language is a, it's not just, you see,
okay.
a language, it's a kind of a world view, because the language carries a certain approach to the world. And it is a much more technical world that we live in. It's a much more instrumental world in which we live. But you see, if we take that premise or the assumption that it is part of our human nature to look for meaning, then the fact that at certain times in our history we look at meaning, we cannot but look at meaning conceptually or intellectually, will not destroy the basis of it. Um, because I don't think that people who are attracted to the Ginans are necessarily attracted to it out of conceptual intellect.
Mhm.
They may have, they may look at it intellectually, but then itself, you see that there are two different aspects of the intellect. Let me just think of an example now. If you listen to classical music, let's say Western classical music. Now, like many of our people in our generation, I was not brought up on European classical music, but still, if you listen to Mozart or Beethoven, you sense that there are some very deep uh, meanings there. That there is a wrestling with very deep questions of the meaning of life. Now, if you hear a musicologist speaking about, say, Beethoven's symphony, he will tell you about the notes, the length of the notes, the pitches, the intervals, the rhythm, the half notes and the full notes, and the movements, the exposition and the development, and so on and so forth. You see, this is all conceptual thinking. But in the end, people then go to listen to the music, because ultimately it is the music which speaks. And your conceptual thinking of the structure of that music can, in fact, help you better to understand the music, to appreciate the music itself, provided you don't stop at the conceptual understanding.
Mhm.
Because stopping at the conceptual understanding is like learning what swimming involves without ever swimming at all. You can learn about swimming in a way a physiologist will describe the movements of your arms and legs, etc. But in the end, it is swimming itself which counts as
Yeah.
swimming. So an equivalent process has to take place about, from the meaningfulness of the Ginans, as you said, was there in your parents' and grandparents' time, to the conceptual thinking that we do now, back to meaningfulness again. But if you don't take that second step, then you would be permanently in a state of alienation from that literature.
Mm. No, that certainly, yeah, makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that response. I do have a few questions, but I'll kind of hold myself. I see four hands going up, and I do have some questions. Our Alvaz Rahim Govindji has asked a few questions, and I want to take those as well. But before that, we have received a question from Tanzania, and it's a simpler, but we get this quite often. So you must have heard this before. Uh, Tariqa boards have published two volumes of 105 Ginans. Um, is it possible to sing other Ginans in Jamaat Khana, or one needs to stick to these 210?
You see, this is an institutional question, which
Okay.
I mean, this is a question to be asked of the institutions of which I'm not a part. I mean, practices in the Jamaat Khan are determined by the Jamaati authorities, Muhi Kamariyas and Itrebs and etc. etc. But I would say this, that uh, it would be a great loss if our knowledge of Ginans was limited to a certain selection. I think that the heritage of the Ginans, like the heritage of any other religious literature, should be available in its full possible scope. Uh, One thing I noticed, because just before speaking today, a day or 2 days ago, just yesterday, in fact, I was looking at the Ginan called Anandakal, and I was quite flabbergasted to see in the copy that fell into my hands something that I could not recognize, because large parts of it, which have to deal with the pageantry on the last day, which is part of the Anandakal as I remember it, were missing. And so I think it is high time that our research institutions, and this is where the IIS's role does come in, is to preserve and study and make available the entire corpus of the Ginans as far back as possible, so that you can see what it originally was before the evolution and the changes that happened for reasons which we need not go into now, came into being. Uh, but this is a separate question from whether one can sing those Ginans in the Jamaat Khana or not. It's a matter of attitude and understanding. Sometimes practices in the Jamaat Khana change when the understanding changes. You see, we were, I think, quite rightly concerned in previous decades about what our identity as Muslim community would mean if certain Ginans with their mythological themes were current. But I think now that we have time has passed, has elapsed, we could have a better understanding of the fact that the mythology itself is not a problem. It is how we interpret it, how we understand it, which is an issue. And I've tried to give you some indications of how we might do that in my talk.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So Rizwan is asking, and I think this is another kind of concern that most of us have, especially in the field of education. Either we are teaching or we are delivering biases or interacting with the young minds. Um, isn't the intimacy that we have been talking about with this literature, I mean, don't we need to cultivate it over a period, and shouldn't it start at a young age? Uh, it's like so the question that he's asking is, it's like a relationship that needs to be invested in over time for it to yield ever richer value.
Yes,
So I think there is a statement there, but I think there is question as well how this intimacy can be cultivated.
I think that's a good observation. It's a very good observation. Uh, I mentioned earlier Aristotle's work on ethics, the
Yes.
Nicomachean Ethics, and there is one statement that philosophers have commented on this. It's a very famous remark of his. You see, it's a book on ethics, and he's talking about what, when, for instance, are certain virtues to be applied. When he talks about virtues, he's thinking of things like courage, uh, generosity, honor, and so on. Now we know that in life, sometimes what we do is courageous, but sometimes courage can become recklessness. If you jump into the sea when to save a drowning person, when you are not yourself a swimmer, then you are not being courageous. You are being reckless. Uh, if you think that you will somehow learn to swim for the first time while trying to save a drowning person, you will have two deaths and two funerals instead of one. So it is no longer a virtue. Generosity can become prodigality. You see, when
Yeah.
somebody becomes a spendthrift
Mm.
and spends everything that he has,
Yeah.
that's not generosity. But now, that's not the point. I mean, the point is what I'm going to say now.
Mhm.
Is Aristotle then makes a remark that all this, of course, assumes that we already are sensitive to virtues,
Mm.
that we
Yeah.
are already assuming that courage and generosity, etc.,
Mm.
are virtues. And he says this: virtues, talking about virtues, will make sense only to those who have already been brought up virtuously. Meaning that if somebody has not been already inculcated in thinking virtuously, then a philosopher is incapable of making them virtuous. One has already to have this gut feeling, this training, this second nature, as it were, of being virtuous. One only goes to philosophy then for clarification, for elaboration, for further interpretation. Literature cannot speak to a person if she or she has not been brought up already with a sensitivity to literature. Music will be meaningless to a person unless and until they have been brought up listening to music. So I'm absolutely of the opinion that this and other literature is something that has to be non conceptually in the first instance, non intellectually, be part of one's upbringing. Because we are talking about a childhood where um, intellectualization becomes a damaging thing. There has to be a sensitivity to literary, musical, and ethical values. And then the conceptual, intellectual process enters as a refinement, as an improvement, as an interpretation, as a modification, as a correction, and as a further building on a spirit which has already been inherited and in which one has been conditioned and trained to begin with.
Thank you. Thank you. It does make sense. Um, I'm surprised with that recording stopped uh, message, but I hope somebody will take care of that. Um, Can I request the organizers to enable the chat, please? I have been receiving messages for that. I see a lot of people who have raised hands. I see Khalil there, Irfan there, Amina there. Shahnaz has been waiting for a long time. I'll start with Shahnaz, who was the first one to raise the hand. So I'm unmuting you, Shahnaz. Ask your question, please.
Thank you very much. It was a very luminous information that you gave. Lastly, what you were talking about, that it's all these characters should be inculcated from childhood, from birth. And it's very sad that, we have introduced different type of music now in the Jamaat Khana. I mean, the Ginans are changed, the rag and everything, where some of them are not very happy about the whole thing. But I came across a firman of Shah Rahim. It was I'll just forward it in, so I won't take much time. Everybody needs to answer, but I really loved it. In the chat, if you could enable the chat, I can go ahead and put that for Man. It was particularly regarding I Rahman Rahman's Rag. And he made it a point to tell the president that when I come to for the Didar, could you ask the Jamaat to, or the children or whoever is in charge, to to recite that particular Ginan, because he wanted to know the rag about it. So I'll go ahead and send it. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I really enjoyed. Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. So Khalil has already put a question in the chat. Khalil, I'm unmuting you. Please ask the question. I think that would be good to hear from you. If you are.
Hi, Alima. Sorry. So firstly, it's a different Khalil in the chat. So I don't know whether
Oh,
it's a different
okay.
from me.
No, I thought it was you, but
Yeah.
sorry. Khalil, go ahead, ask your question. I'll then
Yeah.
ask Khalil to.
Sure. This is more of a critical comment made with respect, of course. So Dr. Ismail, I heard when you say a few moments ago that we should not take what the Ismaili Neoplatonic thinkers say about the structure of reality literally, right? And you specifically said that you shouldn't think of the one or the intellect as parts of the universe. And the main reason you gave for this was, well, we have quantum physics today, so therefore we shouldn't take this literally. I would respectfully say that I believe your position on this, and you're not the only one who takes this position. There seem to be many at the IAS who take this position, but it seems like your guys' position on this is based on a category error. Firstly, because when we read the past Ismaili thinkers, and there are also contemporary Ismaili thinkers, myself included, who still take this stuff literally. For us, the one, God, the universal intellect, the universal soul, they're not parts of the universe. They're not constituents of the physical cosmos for us. They are metaphysical preconditions on which the existence of the universe is based on. So these are not like parts of physical matter in the first place. So I'm not sure why we should just sort of stop taking this literally or seriously, especially when everybody in the Ismaili tradition who wrote about these things, Kirmani, Khosrow, they all took it literally, like in the sense of the intellect and soul are objective realities. One is an objective reality. The second thing you said, which is also part of my critique, is you mentioned like, okay, well, modern physics invalidates this somehow. Modern physics doesn't study the metaphysical. Modern physics studies the structure and behavior of physical reality, which is great, which is very good for humankind. But what quantum physics says has actually no bearing on the metaphysical underpinnings of the universe. And this is not some fringe opinion that I'm saying because we have some attachment to the past. There are many modern philosophers today, from Edward Feser to David Bentley Hart, who would offer the same critique that I've offered. In fact, people in the field of philosophy, they will take seriously arguments put forth by people like myself and others that say that the one does objectively have reality, and the intellect does have objective reality. I just published something last week in a philosophy journal arguing this. So again, to summarize, and this is not a question, it's a comment, so I apologize for that. But why are we so quick to simply jettison the metaphysical teachings of Ismaili thinkers in the name of modern physics when modern physics has no bearing on the truth of the metaphysics? Past
I,
Ismaili guys didn't argue for this based on modern
Khalil,
physics or
yeah,
even their physics.
yeah.
Thank you.
I think Khalil, you made your point clear. Let's.
I, I, um, I think you see, all I would say is that you are agreeing with me in the guise of disagreeing with me. I have absolutely no objection whatsoever to taking those ideas as metaphysical. I was saying that, in fact, contrary to, to taking them as metaphysical, when I meant that you take them literally, meaning that you forget the metaphysical and take them as physical. It's absolutely true that physics has nothing to say about metaphysics. And I'm not thinking of modern physics as invalidating the older those ideas if you take them as metaphysical, because the category mistake lies in taking them as physical and not as metaphysical. So everything seems to hang on this word literally. By literally, I meant taking them as though it was a physics. And that is what I am saying. Reduces, impoverishes the meaning, which you quite rightly say is metaphysical. So I think you see this is it's a misunderstanding of what I said, but I think I was quite clear about that when I said that not to take it literally means to preserve it from the kind of misunderstanding that arises if you take it as a kind of a science.
Okay, great. No, I think. Thank you very much, Dr. Ismail, for that. We have a lot of complimentary messages in the chat about the talk and how inspiring it has been. I'm not reading any of those, but we'll pass on some of those to you. Um, One question that was sent to me on my phone says that in your book, A Scent of Sandalwood, you mentioned that you consulted some manuscripts, and manuscripts I have consulted for it is quote in the quotation marks. Manuscripts I have consulted for purpose of this translation are remarkably similar, if not uniform. Um, and unquote, and then it says, so then why there are differences in the way we sing Ginans?
Sorry, I missed that last sentence
So
about the uniformity. What
yeah,
is the,
uniformity. And the question that follows that quote
yeah,
is
what is the quote? Sorry, can you repeat that line?
so
That
your quote is, the manuscripts that I have consulted
yes,
for purposes of this translation are remarkably similar, if
mhm.
not uniform. So you are saying,
If not uniform.
yeah,
All right.
well,
Okay.
which makes sense. I mean, we have consulted manuscripts; they are quite similar.
Yes, yes.
So the question that follows that quote is that then why there are differences in the way we sing Ginans?
I'm not sure what is meant by the way we sing the Ginans. Are you talking about
I
the
think I
rather
think that
the music of it or the
the words. I think the reference is to the words.
ah? Um, Now this is a very big question. Over time the Ginans underwent changes, and in some of those changes, are some words were changed. Um, for instance, Hari was replaced by Ali, etc. I mean, the Swami was replaced by Maula, and so on. Now, you see, we don't know that Ginans were not changed originally either. I mean, it's not. The history of it is very unclear, and it's quite possible that over time, even in the past, that is before Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, the centuries going back, we are not sure that they were not already evolving and changing. Oral literature often undergoes change in the process of transmission. It was oral literature, you see, although they were also written, but fundamentally it was a recitation. And over generations, these things change. So all I meant, I was referring to the uniformity of what I used for my translation. That was those manuscripts that I'm identifying, because I was conscious of the fact that there are different editions over time and that changes have occurred. Those changes have occurred in recent times because we don't know what happened in the earlier history, but in recent times, because of the concern to make them more compatible with Islamic vocabulary. That was the reason behind it. And that's why there are changes. That's why there is this variation. But I think for research purposes, as I said, we have to go back as far back to the original as possible, because this is what history is. One has to go back to what we can find, of what we can find the earliest possible versions.
Thank you very much for that. Ali Sundarji, who is kind of trained in Hindustani classical music and has been kind of studying Ginans for some years now, he has a question for you. He says that in the Ginan that you've translated in A Scent of Sandalwood, this is not directly related to talk today, but I felt you may have something to add here. Tadhu tadhu mithadu boliye Ginan. There is a verse, Dadama dejore lokane. And he says that I have always understood it as the peer teaching us not to pay heed to the townsfolk. Whereas your angle is granddaughter begging her grandpa, Dada, not to marry her off to the townsfolk or, to some, not to send her away, kind of. So he wants to know, like, what is kind of your take on this? Like,
Both are compatible, with each other. Both are possible ways of looking at it. That's my
right.
short answer.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. Um, Let me quickly go through the chat while there's one question that let me pick it up. Um, so this is about this idea of the purpose of the divine creating humans that we discussed, and the question is, what might be the purpose of the divine creating human and placing them in an uh, illusory or unreal world only for humans to need salvation from it? Does it assume a deliberate separation of human soul from the real into unreal, only with the need to return back to the real? It's
Yes. Well,
pretty poetic, but I hope you have conveyed the message.
yes. No, that's a good question, because it's one of those questions that I think has to be questioned. And I mean this quite seriously. I'll, I'll, I'll explain it like this. You see, the very question of why did God create human beings is a question that a human being cannot ask, because it involves looking at the universe from outside it, looking at it, in other words, from God's point of view. Every time we think of God as somebody whom we can understand and observe and explain and justify, we are thinking from God's point of view. Um, Now, this word, this phrase, point of view, is a very important phrase, you see, because there is a book by a philosopher, not totally relevant the title is relevant, not the contents. to the topic, this topic. And I'm just looking at it from across because it's on my shelf. The title of it is The View from Nowhere. Now, that's a splendid title, The View from Nowhere. And it's a book that argues that we always look at things from a point of view. And I think, you see, when we talk about God, this whole business of talking about what God is like, whether he exists or does not exist, I think I said enough about it, but maybe I said it very quickly
Mm.
in passing. That that's a spectator's and observer's angle. And an observer's angle does not work because you are talking about something of which you are a part. Human beings, as part of nature, cannot raise the question of nature from outside nature. If you think of God as a concept that arises from our experience of the world, that is where you have to stay. You have to stay put at that experience of the world, because the moment we say let's get out of this experience and think about God's purpose, that question is a misquestion. You say, if you know what I mean, I'm inventing a word, misquestion, meaning a misplaced question. And this is not. I'm not saying that this is just our mistake, because human beings are prone to doing that. It is part of our nature. You say this is what Kant. Uh, it's a difficult work, but Kant pointed this out, that this, what he called a metaphysical illusion, by which he meant trying to do metaphysics while ignoring the human point of view from which metaphysics is done, is a perennial temptation for us. And that temptation has to be resisted. I'm afraid I can't. I mean, I may not have made this as clear as possible, but it is something that would take a long time to explain. But I hope that something of it comes through.
Yeah. Just if you could repeat the philosopher that you quoted last.
That was
The
Kant.
Kant. Okay.
Immanuel Kant.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's just, there was some
Yeah.
kind of,
Yes.
we missed that word. Um, so there are quite a few questions. We have been online for almost 2 hours now. So I think we'll have to call this an end, but there is an interesting question. So I'm going to read it, and you can decide whether you want to respond to it now. The person has not written the name. Person calls himself, herself F. Thank you for your insightful presentation, Dr. Ismail. I was hoping you might be able to speak to the place of the feminine in the Ginanic articulation of the divine-human relationship, and to what extent does it signal a deeper metaphysical principle within the spiritual universe of the Ginans, the Ginans evoke? Does the feminine presence represent more than just poetic imagery? Does it point to a fundamental, deeper spiritual or metaphysical truth within the worldview of cosmic structure and Ginans that Ginans present?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I think the question would need to be.
Little kind of focus.
Yes, it is. I'm not sure it is obscure to me. But
Right.
if you mean by that there a masculine and feminine principle in uh, metaphysically in existence, the whole, I would say no.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
see, I think one must remain as much within the bounds of experience as possible. I am reminded that there is a remark in a text called Hakikat ad-Din
Yeah.
uh,
Risala dar
by
hakikat.
Shahabuddin Shah, who was the eldest son of the 47th Imam, uh, quoting Hazrat Ali uh, to the effect that an insect which has one sting,
Mm.
encountering an insect with two
Mm.
stings,
Yeah.
will think of that insect as
God.
a god.
Yeah.
Metaphysics becomes a very misplaced exercise if we forget that the way we think about reality is inescapably influenced by the kind of bodies that we have, of the fact that we have two genders, male and female, and so on. These things play a part in how we understand reality to be. It's wrong to think of them as descriptive of reality itself. The fact that we cannot but think as the embodied beings we are, with the kind of minds that we have, the kind of brains that we have, the kind of nervous system that we have, the kind of bodies that we have, the kind of concepts that we have in our mind, and the kind of genders into which the human race is divided. These are our characteristics, and our characteristics color our point of view. We cannot remove this point of view and think of a metaphysics from no point of view.
Thank you very much for that. I think you've responded to the question, though the question was little kind of not very clear, but I think you got the sense of what the person is trying to ask. I think this is the time when I mean, there are many questions, and there are a lot of comments, and what I'll do is I'll get those printed and pass them on to you, and maybe at some other juncture, people have taken on, by the way, your offer of having a chat on discussion on AI at some point, but also they have suggested a couple of other topics that they would want to hear you on. So I'll pass on those things as well. But I just got intrigued by this comment, and I thought I would read that as kind of to express our gratitude. The comment reads, it's somebody called Fardi. I don't know, you might recognize, or it is like Farid misspelled. I don't know. As always, it was a privilege to listen to Dr. Ismail. I was thrown back to many occasions when I had the privilege of learning from the great teacher. Like a great poetry, his talks make us look at the familiar in an unfamiliar way. His talk makes us look at the familiar in an unfamiliar way. I need to take my leave now with a feeling of joy and gratitude. And I think that's the feeling of many of us. It's the topic that sometimes we don't realize that we don't know enough of, because it's so familiar. It's so much part of us and our tradition that we sometimes feel that, okay, we understand Ginans, we know how to look at the Ginans, what Ginans are, but it's only when we listen to a person of your caliber and experience that we realize that there is a lot that we need to learn about this tradition, to meaningfully engage with this tradition. So let me again thank you, Dr. Ismail. On behalf of the Association for the Study of Ginans, we have the chairman of the executive board, Shiraz Pradhan here, but we also have the chairman of the board of governors, Mohammad Moledina. And on behalf of them, but from all the governors and all the executive committee members and everybody in the audience. At one point in time, we had exhausted our Zoom capacity and we had about 480 plus logins on the Zoom, and there were 88 logins. I just checked it once. I was so getting distracted, so I didn't go back. But at one point, there were 88 people on YouTube as well. So over 550 people benefited from this talk, and we are grateful for taking out this time and kind of enlightening us with your knowledge, and also those directional input that you gave about how we can take this, kind of field further, but if not the field, at least the the idea of Ginanic studies, can benefit from those perspectives that you've provided. So thank you very much for that. And with all our best wishes, we look forward to your next session. And the audience, Dr. Ismail has agreed to be the keynote speaker at a conference that we are going to announce soon on the Ginans, inshallah, in September. Uh, I don't want to confuse with the dates. There are two dates that we are exploring in September, but this is the third week of September that we are talking about, and Dr. Ismail has kindly agreed to be the keynote speaker there. And we do hope that many of you will be able to join us physically at the Aga Khan Center or SOAS, wherever the conference is being held. Uh, and if not, then via Zoom, because we do hope to transmit some of the sessions on Zoom as well. And once again, thank you, Dr. Ismail, for all your
Thank you.
mentorship and
I'm very
support.
grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Audience can stay online if you want to put something in the chat. I'm going to archive the chat. We'll look at it closely because we have not been able to take all the questions. So please continue on the online and continue using the chat for a few more minutes. I request the organizers to keep the chat on for some time. But Dr. Ismail, we can take the leave and say
Thank you.
Khuda Hafiz at this point in time.
Thank you.
Thank you.